Chapter 1. Arrival at Blackwood Manor. The carriage rattled along the winding dirt road, its wheels crunching over gravel as Eleanor Blackwood peered out into the misty landscape. The towering silhouette of Blackwood Manor loomed ahead, its Gothic spires piercing the storm-heavy sky. A deep sense of unease settled in her chest as she traced the winding path leading to the mansion's entrance. The once pristine estate, now swallowed by creeping ivy and decay. As the carriage pulled to a stop, the great wooden doors creaked open on their own, revealing the dimly lit foyer. A grand chandelier hung from the ceiling, its crystals dulled with dust, casting fractured light over the checkered marble floor. Eleanor stepped forward, her footsteps echoing unnaturally through the cavernous space. There was a heaviness in the air, a feeling of something unseen watching from the shadows. "Welcome, Miss Blackwood." A voice broke the silence, smooth yet cold. Eleanor turned sharply to find an aging butler standing at the base of the grand staircase. His expression was unreadable, his posture unnervingly still. "We've been expecting you." "I wasn't aware anyone knew I was coming," Eleanor replied hesitantly. The butler's lips twitched into a ghost of a smile. "Blackwood Manor always knows when its last heir returns." A chill ran down Eleanor's spine. She had inherited the estate after her uncle's sudden passing, a man she barely remembered from childhood tales. But as she stepped deeper into the house, something whispered in the back of her mind. A warning, an unspoken memory, buried beneath time. The door slammed shut behind her, and the gas lamps lining the walls flickered as if reacting to her presence. The air thickened, the temperature dropping noticeably. Somewhere from the depths of the manor came a sound, a faint, disembodied whisper that sent a shiver down her spine. She wasn't alone, and Blackwood Manor had no intention of letting her leave. Chapter 2. The Whispering Hallways. Eleanor wandered deeper into the manor, the dim candlelight barely illuminating the endless corridors stretching before her. The thick scent of aged wood and dust filled her nostrils as she traced her fingers along the peeling wallpaper, her pulse quickening with every creak beneath her feet. Then she heard it, a whisper, low and distant yet unmistakable. She froze, her breath catching in her throat. The voice was faint, as if carried by the wind, but there was no breeze in the manor. It slithered through the hallway, indistinct yet urgent, a chorus of hushed voices murmuring in a language she couldn't understand. Eleanor turned sharply, scanning the corridor behind her. Empty. The flickering gas lamps cast elongated shadows against the walls, but there was no one there. And yet, the whispering continued, growing stronger, swirling around her like unseen figures pressing close. Her pulse pounded. She stepped forward, following the eerie murmurs, drawn to them despite the cold dread pooling in her stomach. As she neared the end of the hall, an arched doorway loomed before her. The door was slightly ajar, the darkness beyond swallowing the weak glow of the candlelight. With a trembling hand, she pushed it open. The whispering ceased instantly. A rush of cold air snaked around her, extinguishing the candle in her grasp. She shuddered as a deep silence settled over the space, thick and suffocating. Eleanor's eyes struggled to adjust, her heartbeat hammering in her ears. The room was empty, or so it seemed. Then, in the reflection of a dust-covered mirror in the far corner, she saw it. A shadow standing behind her. Chapter 3. Shadows in the Mirror. Eleanor's breath hitched as her eyes locked onto the mirror. The dust-coated glass barely reflected the dim glow of the gas lamps, but the figure standing behind her was unmistakable. A tall, shadowy silhouette loomed, its features obscured by the grime and flickering candlelight. She spun around, heart hammering in her chest. The room was empty. A shiver ran down her spine. Slowly, she turned back to the mirror. The shadow was still there, unmoving, watching. But now, its head tilted ever so slightly, as if acknowledging her fear. Eleanor stumbled backward, her hand flying to her mouth to stifle a gasp. The cold air pressed against her skin, thick with something unseen. She reached out hesitantly, fingers trembling as they hovered over the glass. The moment she made contact, a sharp crack echoed through the room. The mirror splintered beneath her touch. A jagged fracture ran through the glass, dividing the reflection. But it wasn't her own reflection that was affected. The shadow in the mirror remained whole. It leaned forward, its form shifting unnaturally. The broken shards rippled as if the mirror was made of water, and the shadow reached out. Eleanor jerked away just as the candlelight flickered violently, the flame nearly snuffed out by an unseen force. The whispering returned, a chorus of voices rising around her, pressing in. She clutched her chest, trying to steady her breath. Her rational mind screamed for her to leave, but some unseen force rooted her to the spot. Then a single voice cut through the murmurs, clear as a bell. "Help me." Eleanor's blood ran cold. The voice had come from inside the mirror. Chapter 4. The Locked Room. Eleanor's pulse thundered in her ears as she backed away from the mirror, the haunting voice still echoing in her mind. Her instincts screamed for her to flee, but something about the whisper, pleading, desperate, kept her frozen in place. The air grew thick, heavy with an oppressive force, and the candle in her grasp flickered violently, as if struggling to survive against an unseen presence. Then, without warning, the door to the corridor slammed shut. Eleanor whirled around, her breath catching in her throat. The doorknob rattled as she lunged for it, but it refused to turn. Panic coiled in her chest. She was trapped. A chill ran down her spine as she turned back to the room, her gaze falling upon an armoire standing against the far wall. It was massive, its dark wood polished but eerily untouched by dust. Unlike the rest of the manor, which bore the weight of time and neglect, this piece looked almost preserved. The whispering resumed. Eleanor stiffened. The sound no longer came from the mirror. It came from the armoire. She hesitated, her fingers tightening around the candle's base. The door to the armoire was slightly ajar, just enough to reveal a sliver of darkness within. As she stepped closer, the voices grew louder, layering over one another in a fevered murmur. A gust of cold air swept past her, carrying the scent of damp earth and decay. Eleanor's throat tightened. With shaking hands, she reached out and pulled the armoire doors open. A rush of icy air exploded outward, snuffing out the candle and plunging the room into darkness. Eleanor stumbled backward, gasping as the temperature plummeted. She squinted into the void of the armoire, but her eyes refused to adjust. Then, from deep within the shadows, something moved. A skeletal hand emerged first, its fingers long and impossibly thin, dragging against the wooden frame. A faint, agonized whisper escaped the dark depths, a voice both ancient and mournful. A face began to materialize. Gaunt, hollow-eyed, its mouth twisted in a silent scream. Eleanor choked back a cry, her body frozen in terror. Then the whisper turned to a hiss. "You should not have come." A sudden force slammed into her chest, sending her sprawling to the ground. The room trembled, the air thick with an unnatural energy. The mirror behind her shattered completely, shards scattering across the floor. Eleanor scrambled to her feet, her limbs weak with terror. The armoire door creaked, beginning to close on its own. But before it shut completely, the figure inside lunged forward. Eleanor screamed. Chapter 5. The Weeping Ghost. Eleanor's scream echoed through the room, swallowed almost instantly by the suffocating silence that followed. She scrambled backward, her hands slipping on the cold wooden floor as the armoire door slammed shut with a resounding thud. The force of it rattled the walls, sending a shiver of unseen energy rippling through the air. Then, from behind the armoire came a sound, a faint, pitiful sob. Eleanor froze, her pulse hammering. The sob was soft, almost childlike, yet filled with an unbearable sorrow that made her chest tighten. It echoed through the room, curling around her like an unseen presence. She knew she should run. Every instinct screamed at her to leave the room, to escape whatever horror lurked in the darkness. But something about the crying made her pause. It wasn't a threat. It was grief. Pure, raw, unrelenting sorrow. Slowly, Eleanor forced herself to her feet. Her trembling fingers gripped the nearest candlestick, though its wax had long since melted away. With slow, cautious steps, she approached the armoire, her breath coming in shallow gasps. The sobbing continued. Eleanor reached out and placed a hesitant hand against the wooden surface. The moment her fingers made contact, the temperature in the room dropped so suddenly that her breath turned to mist. A chill crept through her bones, but she didn't move away. "Who are you?" she whispered. For a long moment, there was no response. Just the sound of weeping, rising and falling in waves of despair. Then, a voice, fragile, trembling, emerged from the darkness behind the armoire. "Please, help me." Eleanor's breath caught. The voice belonged to a girl? She hesitated, her mind reeling. How could there be someone here? The manor had been abandoned for years, untouched save for the occasional visitor who never stayed long. And yet, the presence in the room was unmistakably real. Summoning what little courage she had left, Eleanor grasped the edge of the armoire and pulled. The heavy wood groaned in protest as she strained against it, her heart pounding in anticipation. Inch by inch, she dragged it away from the wall, revealing a hidden alcove behind it. A small figure huddled in the shadows. She was young, perhaps no older than 10. Her dress was tattered and faded, her dark hair hanging in tangled waves around her pale face. Her hands clutched at the fabric of her dress, her shoulders shaking with silent sobs. When she finally lifted her head, Eleanor's breath caught in her throat. The girl's eyes were hollow, not empty, but vast. Deep pools of darkness that seemed to stretch beyond comprehension. Tears streaked her cheeks, vanishing into the abyss where her eyes should have been. And yet, there was something achingly human in her expression, something that made Eleanor's terror falter just enough to keep her from running. "You shouldn't be here," the girl whispered. "She won't like it." Eleanor swallowed hard. "Who won't like it?" The girl turned her head slightly, as if listening to something Eleanor couldn't hear. Then, with a shuddering breath, she whispered, "The woman in the walls." The moment the words left her lips, the room groaned, as if the house itself was alive. A cold gust of wind howled through the cracks in the walls, carrying with it a distant, echoing laughter. And then the girl was gone. Chapter 6: Secrets in the Cellar. Eleanor stood motionless, her breath hitching in her throat. The little girl had vanished, as if she had never been there at all, yet the echo of her warning still lingered in the cold air. The woman in the walls. The words repeated in her mind, unraveling a sense of dread she couldn't ignore. What did they mean? Who was she speaking about? Determined to find answers, Elena followed a winding staircase down into the depths of Blackwood Manor. The candle in her grasp flickered as she descended, the walls around her narrowing, the air thickening with dampness and decay. The scent of rotting wood and mildew choked her lungs. At the base of the stairs, a heavy wooden door stood before her, its iron handle rusted with age. An old, rusted chain hung loosely from the latch, as if someone had once tried to seal the room shut. She hesitated before pushing it open. A gust of stale air swept past her, the temperature dropping instantly. The cellar was vast, lined with aged wooden beams and stone walls. Rows of wine barrels sat untouched in the corners, their surfaces coated in years of dust. Cobwebs hung from the ceiling like funeral drapes. But something was wrong. This wasn't just a cellar. It was too large, stretching beyond what should have been the manor's foundations. Eleanor's candlelight barely pierced the darkness as she stepped forward. The wooden floor groaned beneath her weight. Then she saw it, a trapdoor nestled between the barrels. Her heart pounded. Why would there be another entrance below the cellar? And why had it been hidden? Eleanor knelt, brushing away years of dust from the edges of the trapdoor. Rusted metal hinges glinted beneath her candle's glow. A small iron ring served as the handle, and with a deep breath, she wrapped her fingers around it, pulling upward. The trapdoor creaked open, revealing a yawning void beneath. A narrow staircase spiraled downward into the abyss. Cold air slithered up from below, carrying whispers too faint to understand. Eleanor's pulse quickened. This wasn't just another storage room. It was something far older, something long forgotten. Gripping the candle tighter, she stepped down. Chapter 7: The Curse Unveiled. The moment Eleanor stepped onto the final stair, an unnatural cold wrapped around her like unseen fingers. The candle in her grasp flickered violently, casting erratic shadows along the stone walls. The whispers that had followed her through the manor grew louder, almost frantic, swirling around her in a chaotic dance of dread. The chamber before her was unlike any part of Blackwood Manor she had seen. The stone walls were etched with symbols, some ancient, others more recent, as if someone had tried to overwrite the past with new markings. At the center of the room stood an altar, covered in layers of dust and cobwebs, but still carrying an unmistakable aura of something forbidden. Eleanor swallowed hard, her throat dry. The air itself felt thick, charged with an energy she couldn't explain. Her fingers tightened around the candle as she took a step forward, her gaze landing on a tattered book resting upon the altar. The cover was made of leather, brittle with age, its pages yellowed and curling at the edges. With hesitant fingers, she brushed away the dust and read the words inscribed on the cover. The Blood Oath of Blackwood. Her heart pounded. This was it. The truth behind the whispers. The curse that had plagued her family for generations. With trembling hands, she flipped open the book. The ink within was smudged in places, but the words were clear. The Blackwood line is bound to the shadows. A debt must be paid. Blood for sanctuary. One must remain, or the house will claim its own. Elena's breath caught. The words sent a chill down her spine, their meaning undeniable. Someone had to stay. That was the price of inheriting Blackwood Manor. If no one remained, the house itself would take what it was owed. A sharp gust of wind howled through the chamber, extinguishing her candle. Darkness swallowed her whole, and with it came a voice. "You are the last, Eleanor. You cannot leave." A shadow shifted at the edge of her vision. The candle's faint ember flickered back to life, illuminating the altar once more. But now, she was not alone. A woman stood before her, draped in tattered black robes, her face obscured by a veil of shadow. But Eleanor knew who she was. The woman in the walls. Eleanor staggered back, her pulse racing. "Who are you?" The figure tilted her head, her voice a whisper carried by the wind. "I was the first, bound by blood, as you will be." "No." Eleanor shook her head, her voice trembling. "I won't stay here. I won't be part of this." The woman's laughter was hollow, echoing through the chamber. "The house has already decided." The walls groaned, as if the very foundation of Blackwood Manor was alive. The whispers turned to wails, rising into a deafening chorus of despair. The shadows in the corners of the room twisted, reaching out toward Eleanor. She turned, bolting for the staircase, her heartbeat thundering in her ears. The wind roared around her, hands grasping at her ankles, trying to pull her back. The last thing she heard before she reached the stairs was the woman's final whisper. "There is no escape." Chapter 8. A grim reason in the dark. Eleanor burst from the hidden chamber, her breath ragged as she scrambled up the winding cellar steps. The weight of unseen hands clutched at her dress, the shadows whispering in hurried, indecipherable voices. She threw herself into the main cellar, slamming the trapdoor shut behind her. The air was thick with dust, her candle trembling in her grip. The manor had changed. The moment she stepped back into the hallway, she knew something was different. The walls, once lined with peeling wallpaper, now pulsed as if they were alive. The sconces flickered, casting shifting, elongated shadows that seemed to move of their own accord. The air was thick with something unseen, a presence pressing against her skin, suffocating in its intensity. Then the whispers returned. Eleanor turned sharply. They came from everywhere and nowhere, overlapping, weaving into an unbearable chorus of voices. She staggered forward, desperate to reach the grand staircase, but the shadows on the walls stretched unnaturally, twisting toward her like reaching hands. Something was here. Something was waiting. A slow creak came from the parlor door. She turned, her stomach knotting with dread. The door, which had been closed when she arrived, now stood ajar. A deep cold radiated from within, and Eleanor's breath misted in the air. She stepped forward, drawn by an unseen force, her fingers tightening around the candle's base. A figure stood in the room. At first, it was barely more than a ripple in the darkness, but as Eleanor's candlelight flickered, it took form. A woman, draped in a tattered black dress, her face obscured by a long, dark veil. She did not move, did not breathe. The only sign that she was real was the way the air grew heavier around her, as if the very house bent to her presence. Eleanor's voice trembled. "Who are you?" The woman in the veil raised her head, her movements slow, unnatural. From beneath the sheer fabric, something gleamed. Not eyes, not flesh, but darkness, an abyss that swallowed the light. Then she spoke. "You were never meant to leave." The room exploded into darkness. The candle in Eleanor's grasp extinguished, the shadows stretching and swallowing everything in their path. The house groaned, the walls vibrating with unseen force. A gust of icy wind knocked her backward, and as she fell, she saw the woman step closer, her form gliding through the blackness with impossible grace. And then, a hand clamped over Eleanor's mouth. The last thing she heard before the darkness claimed her was the whisper of the woman's voice, soft, almost sorrowful. "Now, you belong to us." Chapter 9. The Final Seance. Eleanor awoke to the sensation of ice creeping along her skin. The darkness that had swallowed her was now a thick, suffocating void, pressing in from all sides. She tried to move, but her limbs felt weighed down, as if something unseen coiled around them. A faint glow flickered ahead, a cluster of candles arranged in a perfect circle on the cold stone floor. Their golden light barely pushed back the surrounding shadows. The air carried the scent of aged parchment and melted wax, mingling with something far more unsettling, something decayed, something ancient. Her breath came in shallow gasps as she took in her surroundings. The chamber she found herself in was different from the hidden cellar. The walls were covered in symbols, some carved deep into the stone, others painted in a dark, faded ink. In the center of the candlelit space sat a single wooden chair, its presence oddly deliberate, as though waiting for someone to take their place. Then, a voice whispered her name. Eleanor turned sharply, her pulse hammering. The shadows along the walls shifted, forming the indistinct shape of figures gathered in the gloom. Their faces were blurred, as if time had eroded their features. The whispering grew louder, layered voices overlapping in a mournful chant. "Sit, Eleanor. The seance must begin." A force, invisible yet undeniable, guided her forward. Her feet moved on their own, her body obeying something far older than her will. She sank into the chair, her breath hitching as the air grew impossibly cold. The figures in the darkness closed in, forming a circle around the candles. The voice came again, stronger this time. "Call her. Call the first." Eleanor's hands trembled. She didn't understand. Call who? The whispering ceased abruptly, plunging the chamber into silence so complete it made her ears ring. Then, one of the shadowed figures stepped forward. Unlike the others, it held shape. A woman draped in black, her veil shifting as though caught in a breeze that did not exist. Eleanor's heart clenched as recognition struck her. "The woman in the walls," she whispered. The figure nodded. The shadows around her swelled, pulsing as though alive. The air grew thick with energy, an unspoken demand pressing into Eleanor's bones. She swallowed her fear, forcing the words out as if compelled by something beyond herself. "I call upon the first." The moment the words left her lips, the flames of the candles surged, stretching high, illuminating the chamber in a searing golden light. The walls trembled, a deep groan reverberating through the stone. The air vibrated, and then a scream. It came from nowhere and everywhere at once, raw and filled with agony. The shadows convulsed, writhing violently as if resisting something unseen. The veiled woman raised her hands, and the cry grew louder, merging into a whirlwind of voices trapped between worlds. Eleanor clutched the arms of the chair as pain shot through her skull. Images flashed in her mind. A woman being sealed inside the walls of Blackwood Manor, her hands clawing at the stone as she was buried alive. A book of ancient rites, its pages stained with the ink of a binding curse. Generations of Blackwood heirs succumbing to the same fate. Their souls bound to the house, unable to escape. And then, the final image, herself. Eleanor saw herself sitting in the chair just as she was now, but older, her eyes empty, her form nothing more than a shade of what she once was. She was doomed to be the next, to be one with the house, to never leave. The truth settled over her like a shroud. This seance wasn't to break the curse. It was to complete it. Eleanor's body tensed as she fought against the unseen force binding her to the chair. The shadows lunged toward her, whispering, pleading, demanding. The veiled woman extended a hand, her voice soft, sorrowful. "Accept your place." Eleanor screamed. The candles extinguished at once, plunging the chamber into darkness. Chapter 10. Escape or Eternity. The chamber plunged into total darkness. Eleanor gasped for breath, her chest rising and falling in panicked heaves as she strained to hear beyond the silence. The whispers had vanished, but the weight of the unseen presence remained, thick and oppressive. The air was dense, pressing against her skin like unseen hands trying to pull her into the abyss. Then, from the void, the voice returned. "Eleanor, it is time." A sudden surge of cold wrapped around her wrists, binding them to the chair. She thrashed against the invisible force, heart pounding, but the grip was relentless. The shadows around her pulsed, flickering between the light of the remaining candle embers and an ever-growing darkness. She had to fight. She had to escape. Through the chaos of her fear, she forced her mind to focus. The book. The blood oath of Blackwood. It had spoken of a debt, a sacrifice. But nowhere did it say that it could not be undone. Her gaze darted toward the altar. The ancient book still lay there, its brittle pages fluttering unnaturally as if caught in an unseen wind. Eleanor knew she had one chance. Gathering every ounce of strength, she lunged forward, wrenching herself free of the unseen grasp, just long enough to grab the book. As her fingers made contact, a sharp, searing pain shot through her skull. Visions flooded her mind. She saw generations of Blackwood heirs, each one taken by the house, their souls bound in eternal servitude. The woman in the walls, Margaret Blackwood, the first heir, had been the one to forge the pact, sealing her bloodline to the manor's will. Each descendant had fallen victim to the curse, and now it was Eleanor's turn. But something was different. She could feel it. Unlike those before her, Eleanor had found the truth before it was too late, and she could end it. Shaking, she flipped through the book, the pages turning of their own accord until they stopped on a passage marked in faded ink. The words were nearly unreadable, but she understood their meaning. A sacrifice of blood bound the curse. A sacrifice of fire will break it. Eleanor's breath hitched. Fire. The manor was bound to its secrets, its shadows thriving in darkness. But if she could destroy the book, perhaps she could sever its hold. A gust of wind howled through the chamber as if sensing her intent. The shadows churned violently, figures emerging from the darkness, their hollow eyes fixed on her. The veiled woman stepped forward, her form flickering between solid and spectral. "Do not fight fate, Eleanor," she whispered. "This is where you belong." Eleanor met her gaze, steel settling in her spine. "No. It's where you belong, but it's not where I stay." With that, she turned, seizing the last flickering candle. Before the shadows could close in, she brought the flame to the pages of the book. The moment the fire touched the parchment, an ear-splitting scream filled the chamber. The figures recoiled, their forms twisting in agony as the fire spread. The walls trembled violently, cracks forming in the stone. The room itself began to collapse, the air thick with smoke and embers. The veiled woman shrieked, reaching toward Eleanor with clawed hands, but the flames consumed her, her form dissolving into black mists. The other spirits followed, their wails of torment fading one by one until only silence remained. Eleanor stumbled back, coughing as smoke filled her lungs. The manor was dying. She had to escape. She turned and ran, her feet pounding against the stone as she sprinted toward the stairwell. The house groaned in protest, debris crashing around her. The once grand halls of Blackwood Manor were engulfed in flames, the curse unraveling with each step she took toward freedom. Finally, she reached the entrance hall. The great wooden doors, which had sealed shut upon her arrival, now stood ajar, golden firelight spilling through the cracks. Without hesitation, she threw herself forward, bursting into the cold night air just as the manor gave one final, anguished cry. Blackwood Manor collapsed behind her, the ancient structure crumbling in on itself as flames devoured it whole. The shadows screamed one last time before vanishing into the inferno. And then, silence. Eleanor lay on the damp grass, staring up at the smoke-filled sky. The weight that had burdened her since she arrived was gone. The house, the whispers, the curse, it was all over. She was free. With a final trembling breath, she closed her eyes, letting the cool night air wash over her. For the first time in centuries, Blackwood Manor was at peace. And so was she. The old asylum stood on the edge of town, abandoned for decades, its windows shattered, its walls covered in creeping vines. It was the kind of place no one spoke about, the kind of place parents warn their children to stay away from. But the stories were always there, whispered in hushed tones, about the patients that never left, about the doctors who went mad, about the thing that still lived inside. Ethan never believed in ghost stories. He was a skeptic, always had been. But when his friends dared him to spend the night inside the asylum, he didn't hesitate. It was just a building after all, just walls and dust, nothing more. The front doors groaned as he pushed them open. The air inside was stale, thick with the scent of rot and something else, something metallic. The entrance hall stretched before him, its checkered floor cracked, the peeling wallpaper revealing something darker beneath. The silence pressed against his skull, heavy and suffocating. The others had left him at the gates, laughing as they drove off. He had 12 hours to prove there was nothing here. He checked his phone. No signal. Of course. The flashlight in his hand flickered slightly as he moved deeper inside. The asylum was massive, its hallways stretching endlessly in both directions. Doors lined the walls, their numbers rusted and barely legible. He peered into one of the rooms. An old metal-framed bed sat in the center, its mattress torn open, the stuffing spilling out like something had crawled out of it. The walls were covered in scratches, deep grooves dug into the plaster. He swallowed hard and moved on. A noise echoed down the hall, a soft shuffling. Not the wind, not the building settling, something moving. He turned, his breath hitching. The hallway behind him was darker than it had been before. The shadows seemed thicker, like they were pressing inward. He kept walking, faster now. The sound followed. A low rhythmic scraping, like something dragging along the floor. His flashlight flickered again. Then the laughter started. Faint at first, almost like a child's giggle. But it wasn't right. It was layered, distorted, echoing from every direction. He spun, his heart hammering in his chest. The laughter grew louder, bouncing off the walls, overlapping, twisting into something inhuman. A door ahead of him was slightly open. He ran for it. The moment he crossed the threshold, the laughter stopped. Silence. The air was too cold in here. His breath came out in white puffs. The room was empty except for a wheelchair sitting in the center. Its metal frame rusted, its leather seat cracked and torn. Then it moved just an inch. Then another. Then it rolled toward him. Ethan stumbled back, his flashlight shaking in his grip. The chair lurched forward, its wheels screeching against the tile, moving faster, too fast. He turned and ran. Back into the hall, down the corridor, past doors that now stood open where they had been closed before. The shuffling sound was back, closer, faster. He turned a corner and stopped cold. A woman stood at the end of the hallway. No, not a woman. Something wearing a woman's skin. Her head tilted, her mouth stretched too wide, her eyes black pits. Then her neck snapped sideways. Her head hung there, at an impossible angle, her mouth still curled into that horrible grin. She took a step forward, then another, then she ran. Ethan screamed. He turned, sprinting back the way he came. The doors on either side of the hallway slammed shut as he passed, one by one, the sound like gunshots in the silence. Then The lights went out. Total darkness. His breath came in ragged gasps. Then, a whisper. Right behind him. "Don't run." He felt cold fingers wrap around his wrist. He yanked away, stumbling blindly forward, his hands outstretched. A door. He grabbed the handle, throwing his weight against it. It gave way, and he fell. Ethan woke up in a hospital bed. The ceiling above him was white. The scent of antiseptic filled his nose. He blinked against the bright light. A doctor stood beside him, dressed in old-fashioned attire, his face too smooth, his smile too still. "You're lucky," the doctor said, voice too calm. "Most don't make it out." Ethan's breath caught. His mind screamed at him that something was wrong. He turned his head. The room was filled with beds, and in each bed a patient lay motionless. Their eyes were open. Their mouths hung wide in silent screams. The doctor's smile never faltered. "You should rest now." Ethan tried to move. His arms wouldn't respond. Neither would his legs. He looked down. He wasn't in a hospital bed. He was strapped to a gurney. The leather bindings dug into his wrists. The doctor turned, nodding to someone just out of view. A machine hummed to life. Something sharp pierced Ethan's skin. He tried to scream, but no sound came out. The last thing he saw was the doctor leaning closer, whispering into his ear, "Welcome home." The lights flickered, and the laughter started again. Ethan woke up gasping for air, his body drenched in sweat. His vision swam as he blinked against the sterile fluorescent light burning overhead. His wrist throbbed where the leather restraints had dug into his skin. He wasn't in the asylum anymore. He was in a hospital. The room was empty, except for the steady beeping of a heart monitor beside him. White walls, white sheets, the faint smell of antiseptic clinging to the air. His hands trembled as he gripped the edges of the bed. He remembered the asylum, the whispers, the doctor's smile that stretched too wide. But that had to be a nightmare, didn't it? A nurse entered, her movements eerily smooth. She was tall, too tall. Her limbs just slightly elongated, as if she had been stretched a few inches beyond what was natural. Her face was pale, her smile too still. "You're awake," she said, her voice too flat, too calm. Ethan forced himself to breathe. "Where am I?" The nurse just smiled. The door behind her didn't lead to a hallway. It led to another hospital room. Ethan's blood ran cold. It was identical to the one he was in. Same white sheets, same heart monitor, same empty bed. He turned his head to the right. Another door. Another identical room. His chest tightened. This wasn't a hospital. It was a loop. The nurse stepped closer, her head tilting at an unnatural angle. "You've been here before," she said, her voice just slightly off, like a record playing at the wrong speed. Ethan's heart pounded. He had to get out. He threw off the sheets and swung his legs over the side of the bed. His body felt too light, as if he weren't entirely real. The nurse's smile widened. "You shouldn't leave," she whispered. Ethan ran. He shoved past her, sprinting through the door and into the same room. His breath caught in his throat. He turned. The nurse was still behind him. No, not just one nurse. There were now 3 of her, all identical. all smiling. "You never left," they whispered in unison. Ethan bolted for the far door, throwing himself through it. Another identical room, another door, another, and another. He was trapped. The hospital stretched endlessly, its rooms duplicating with every step he took. Then, the lights flickered. For a split second, the white walls were covered in blood. Faint, almost like a shadow, but there. He kept running. Somewhere behind him, he heard laughter. The lights flickered again. The blood was clearer now, not just on the walls, dripping from the ceiling. Something was wrong with the air. It was thick, heavy, pressing against his skin like something breathing just beneath the surface of the world. Then he saw a shadow standing in the doorway ahead. Not a nurse. Not human. It was him. A second Ethan stood in the room staring back at him, but his eyes were black. His mouth curled into a smile too wide for his face. Ethan stopped cold. The other him lifted a hand and pointed behind him. Ethan turned. The nurses were gone. The hospital was gone. He stood in the asylum again. The hall stretched before him, the walls lined with old, rusted doors. The air smelled of rot and something sour, something dead. A loudspeaker crackled overhead. "Patient 212 has attempted escape. Please return him to his room." Ethan's stomach twisted. The asylum thought he was a patient. The lights overhead buzzed violently, flickering. The walls shifted, the doors moved, stretching like something alive. Then, a sound, the same dragging he had heard before. Something coming down the hallway. He ran. The asylum morphed around him, changing. Every turn led him back to the same hallway. The doors opened slightly, just a crack, enough for fingers to slip through. The whispering started again. "Don't come back. You belong here." His heart pounded against his ribs. He wasn't going to stop. He turned a corner and slammed into someone. The doctor. The same too perfect face. The same frozen smile. "Running again?" the doctor said, his voice soft, almost amused. Ethan staggered back, his breath coming in short gasps. The doctor tilted his head. "You were never supposed to leave." The walls shuddered. The asylum was breathing. The tiles beneath Ethan's feet cracked open, something moving underneath. Hands reaching for him. He screamed. The lights exploded. Ethan woke up in his apartment. His hands shook as he gripped the bed sheets, his breath ragged. His heart slammed against his ribs. Just a nightmare. Just a dream. He let out a weak, trembling laugh. His phone buzzed on the nightstand. He grabbed it. A text message. A known number. "You can't run forever." His stomach twisted. Slowly, he turned his head. The hospital wristband was still around his wrist, and in the reflection of his bedroom window, the doctor stood behind him, smiling.